"What are you doing?" I shouted, waving my arms frantically. The foreman glanced down at his clipboard. "HOA orders. This waterway is being redirected and covered." I stood there in shock, watching as his excavators tore through the delicate ecosystem where my kids had spent countless summer afternoons catching tadpoles and building tiny leaf boats. That creek had been the reason I bought this house in Willow Creek Estates 10 years ago. "There must be some mistake," I insisted. "Nobody told me about this." The foreman shrugged. "Take it up with Mr. Langston. We're just doing what we're paid for." Greg Langston, of course, the new HOA president who moved in 6 months ago and immediately started complaining about everything. My wind chimes, the color of my front door, even the solar lights I installed along the walkway. Now he was destroying my creek. I marched straight to his oversized craftsman-style house with its pristine lawn and rang the doorbell repeatedly. When he finally opened the door, his face showed no surprise. "Ah, I see you've noticed our neighborhood improvement project," he said with a smug smile. "Improvement? You're destroying a natural habitat. Why wasn't I notified?" My voice shook with anger. Langston adjusted his golf polo. "The notice was in last month's HOA newsletter, page 3, I believe. The board voted unanimously. The uncontrolled waterway was creating an unsightly appearance, which affects property values." "That's ridiculous. That creek has been there longer than this entire neighborhood." "Nevertheless, the CCRs clearly state that the HOA has jurisdiction over exterior appearances. The new landscaping will look much more controlled." He emphasized controlled like it was a sacred word. I spent the rest of the day frantically calling other board members, the county environmental office, even a friend who practiced law. No one could help immediately. By sunset, my beautiful creek had been partially diverted into an ugly concrete channel and covered with decorative stone where it passed behind the homes of Langston and his allies on the board. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how my daughter Lily used to squeal with delight whenever she found a bright little crayfish, or how Caleb had finally learned to skip stones along the wider bends of the stream. The creek wasn't just water. It was woven into our family's memories. The next morning, I drove straight to the Brookfield County Records Office as soon as it opened. I needed to understand the property lines, the HOA's actual authority, anything that could help me fight back. The clerk, an older woman named Marge, seemed sympathetic to my situation. "HOAs think they're little kingdoms," she muttered as she helped me navigate the digital maps of our subdivision. "But they don't always know the whole story." For 4 hours, I pored over property records, plat maps, and the original development plans for Willow Creek Estates. Most of it confirmed what Langston had said. The HOA had broad authority over exterior appearances. But then I found something interesting in the section on emergency access easements. "Marge, what does this notation mean?" I asked, pointing to a line on the map. She adjusted her glasses. "That's interesting. According to this, the emergency access road that runs behind the eastern lots wasn't fully dedicated to the township. Parts of it actually belong to the adjoining lot owners." My pulse quickened. "So the road behind my house partially belongs to me?" She nodded. "It's an easement, so you can't block emergency vehicles. But otherwise, yes, it's your property up to the center line." I thanked her profusely and left with printed copies of everything. As I drove home, an idea started to form. That emergency access road was rarely used for emergencies. Langston and his board buddies all lived along that street and used it as a private shortcut, saving them a drive around the main neighborhood loop. Once I got home, I called my cousin Marcus, who owns a small trucking company. "Hey, how badly do you need garage space for your semis this week?" I asked. "Why? What are you planning?" He sounded both suspicious and intrigued. "Let's just call it a lesson in property rights. How many trucks can you spare for a few days?" Marcus laughed. "For you? After that time you helped me move on Christmas Eve, I've got 5 rigs between hauls right now." Perfect. We made arrangements for early the next morning. That evening, I carefully measured my property line along the emergency access road, marking exactly where I could legally park vehicles without blocking actual emergency access. That night, I slept better than I had in days. I didn't know if my plan would bring back the creek, but at least Langston would know what it felt like to have someone mess with your daily life. Room for a singly car to slowly weave through. Technically accessible for emergency vehicles, but a major headache for regular traffic. I was making coffee when my phone rang. Langston's name flashed on the screen. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, not even waiting for me to say hello. "Exercising my property rights," I replied calmly. "According to county records, I own part of that access road. I'm simply allowing my cousin to park his commercial vehicles on my property." "This is clearly retaliation. I can't even get my car out without scratching it." "I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps you could use the main neighborhood entrance like everyone else. I believe the notice about this parking arrangement was on page 4 of my personal newsletter. Did you not receive it?" The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice cold. "The board will take action." "I look forward to discussing it," I replied, before hanging up. Within an hour, my doorbell was ringing non-stop as angry neighbors demanded I move the trucks. I politely explained the situation to each one, showing them the property records and reminding them how I'd received no warning before my creek was destroyed. Some stormed off, but a few actually listened, especially when I mentioned that the stream was protected under county watershed regulations. By noon, Langston had called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. Phase 1 of my plan was going perfectly. Now I needed to prepare for Phase 2. What would happen when I faced the entire board and a room full of furious neighbors? Would my records be enough, or had I just launched a neighborhood war I couldn't win? The community center buzzed with angry voices when I arrived for the emergency meeting. Langston had clearly rallied his supporters. Nearly 50 residents packed the room, many glaring at me as if I'd personally slashed their tires. I clutched my folder of documents tightly, second-guessing whether I'd pushed too far. "There he is," someone shouted, "the guy blocking our road." Langston stood at the front of the room, his face a mask of righteous indignation. The gavel banged loudly. "This emergency meeting will come to order," he declared. "We are here to address a serious violation of community standards and good faith neighborly conduct." I took a seat in the back row, trying to ignore the whispers around me as Langston launched into a dramatic speech about how my petty, dangerous act was endangering the entire neighborhood by potentially blocking emergency responders. When he finally paused to catch his breath, I raised my hand. "May I respond to these allegations?" "You'll get your turn," he snapped. "First, I'd like to hear from other affected residents." For the next 20 painful minutes, I listened as my neighbors vented their frustration. Elaine Marsh, Langston's loudest ally on the board, complained about nearly scraping her Lexus. Derek Sloan, a developer recently added to the board, warned that vigilante behavior like mine would destroy property values. Finally, Langston turned to me with a smirk. "Now, would you care to explain yourself before we vote on the appropriate penalties?" I stood and walked slowly to the front, every eye in the room following me.
With deliberate calm, I opened my folder and laid the documents on the table. 3 days ago, without real notice to me, the HOA destroyed a natural waterway that ran through my property, one that had existed for generations. My children grew up playing in that creek. It was a sanctuary for wildlife, and it was eliminated because Mr. Langston decided it looked unkempt. I turned to face the room. How many of you actually received proper notice that the creek was being removed? A real notice, not a buried line in a newsletter nobody reads. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Not a single hand went up. I went to the Brookfield County Records Office, and I discovered that the emergency access road running behind our homes is not entirely HOA property. Each homeowner owns the section directly behind their lot, up to the center line. I'm simply exercising my rights to allow parking there, just as the HOA exercised its supposed rights when it buried my creek. Langston's face darkened. "This is clearly retaliatory, and furthermore," I interrupted him, pulling out another document. "I also contacted the county environmental office. That creek is part of a protected watershed. Diverting it without the proper permits is actually illegal." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. That was news to many of them. "That's absurd," Langston sputtered. "The board reviewed all necessary—" From the middle of the room, someone stood up. I recognized Grant Foster, a retired environmental engineer who had lived in the neighborhood for years but rarely engaged in community affairs. I had barely spoken to him since he moved in.
"Actually," Grant said, "he's right." He stepped forward and cleared his throat. "I've been documenting the wildlife in that stream for years as part of the county's biodiversity study. By altering it without the proper environmental review, the HOA has violated at least 3 county-level environmental regulations." Langston looked genuinely stunned. "Why wasn't the board informed of this study?" "I sent a detailed letter when you first proposed the landscaping changes 6 months ago," Grant replied. "It was dismissed without discussion." The energy in the room shifted. I could feel people exchanging glances. Langston's authority was starting to crack. Elaine Marsh was the first to speak up. "That doesn't change the fact that these trucks are a hazard and a complete nuisance. We need to vote to have them removed immediately and deal with this troublemaker." "Before you vote," I said calmly, "you should know I've already filed a formal complaint with the Brookfield County Environmental Protection Agency. Inspectors will be here tomorrow morning. Fines for unauthorized watershed alterations start at $10,000 per day." A shocked silence swept the room. Langston's face drained of color. "Who's responsible for paying those fines?" someone asked nervously. "The HOA," I replied. "Meaning all of us through special assessments, unless, of course, we can reach a more reasonable solution." Langston found his voice. "This is blackmail." "No, this is negotiation. The trucks will be moved once a plan to restore the creek to its natural state is approved. And going forward, any major changes affecting private lots must require direct notice and written consent from the affected homeowners." No one spoke for a moment. Then Grant cleared his throat again. "I propose the formation of an environmental review committee to create a creek restoration plan effective immediately." "Seconded," I said. Another voice chimed in,
Mrs. Abernathy, who lived down the street. "My grandkids used to play in that stream when they visited. I support the idea." Langston looked around, clearly losing control of the room. More residents were nodding, whispering among themselves. Finally, through clenched teeth, he said, "Fine, we'll form a committee. But those trucks need to be moved now, not after some long review process." "I object," I said. "As long as my creek remains buried, the trucks stay. The committee has 3 days to submit a preliminary restoration plan. Once that's done, the trucks go and we work together on the long-term fix." Before Langston could object, Grant raised his hand. "I call for a vote." Hands shot up across the room. The majority supported my proposal. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me with mixed reactions, some supportive, others clearly annoyed but resigned. Grant walked over and quietly handed me his business card. "That took courage," he said. "I've been wanting to challenge Langston's authoritarian streak for months, but I didn't want to rock the boat. It'd be an honor to chair the Environmental Committee." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I had won this round, but I knew Langston wasn't finished. When the room had finally cleared, he walked over. "You think you're clever," he said, voice low and cold. "But today, you made a powerful enemy. I built this community. I have friends in town, in the county offices. Your little stream won't be the only thing buried." He turned and walked out before I could reply, leaving a cold threat hanging in the air, staining what should have been a moment of victory. What had I started? And just how far would Langston go to maintain control over Willow Creek Estates?
The gavel struck the table so hard I thought it might crack. "This emergency meeting of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association is now called to order," Langston growled. My heart pounded as I clutched my folder. The community center was buzzing with voices. Most of these neighbors had never attended an HOA meeting before, but the semi-trailers had caught everyone's attention. People stood along the walls and sat cross-legged on the floor. All 30 chairs had been taken long before the meeting began. Langston scowled. "I want to address the outrageous situation currently blocking our emergency access road, where 5 commercial trucks have made it nearly impossible for residents to return home." Elaine Marsh leapt to her feet, her designer scarf fluttering as she gestured wildly. "My daughter missed her dance recital. We had to walk 4 blocks in the rain because we couldn't get our car out. This is outrageous." She jabbed a finger at me. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. I stayed seated, inhaling deeply, scanning the room. Some faces burned with anger, but others looked curious, uncertain. Langston pointed directly at me. "You have 1 minute to explain yourself before we vote on emergency eviction measures and corresponding fines." I rose slowly and walked to the front, gripping my folder. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak," I began. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I understand everyone's frustration," I began, steadying my breath. "I felt the same thing last week, when a crew showed up without any warning to destroy the creek on my property. That was a board-approved beautification project," Langston interrupted quickly. "Actually," I said, spreading my documents across the table, "I've brought copies of my property deed, survey maps, and the county's waterway protection statutes.
I handed the front row stacks of papers to pass around. The creek that was filled in isn't just on my land. It's a protected natural waterway. And no permits were filed with the Environmental Office for the work. Langston's face flushed a deep red. That's irrelevant to the issue of your trucks blocking. As for the trucks, I continued calmly, sliding more highlighted pages across the table. They're parked on a section of the access road that, according to township records, falls partially within my property line. They are legally parked with valid permits. A tall woman near the back let out a low whistle. Someone else muttered, "Wow, they really messed with the wrong person." Langston snatched up one of the papers. "This doesn't give you the right to block an emergency access route?" "Actually," came a firm voice from the back of the room, "according to Willow Creek Estates bylaws, emergency access must be maintained at a minimum of 12 feet. I measured this morning. Even with the trucks parked, there's still 14 feet of clearance." Heads turned as Grant Foster walked forward. He had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, but rarely spoke at meetings. A retired civil engineer, known for his pristine garden and quiet demeanor, he now carried a thick folder of his own. "I've been documenting the board's actions for some time," Grant said, laying his folder beside mine, "including 7 separate bylaw violations in just the last year." Langston's expression soured. "This meeting isn't about past board actions." "Maybe it should be," Grant replied, flipping open his folder. "Especially the illegal diversion of a protected waterway. That carries potential criminal penalties under state law." The room erupted in voices. Mrs. Gonzalez, who lived 2 streets over, stood up. "My basement flooded for the first time in 20 years, right after they messed with the creek." "My well water turned brown," someone else shouted. Langston banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! This is absurd!" Elaine jumped to his defense. "James has done nothing but try to maintain our property values. That nasty ditch was an eyesore." Grant pulled out a large aerial map and unrolled it across the table. "That nasty ditch is part of Willow Creek, which feeds directly into the county reservoir. It's protected under the Clean Water Act." That was news to me. My research had focused on property boundaries, not environmental law. I looked at Grant with new appreciation. "Furthermore," he said, flipping through the minutes, "I've reviewed the notes from every HOA meeting for the past 5 years. There was never a vote on the creek project, not even a mention. It was done in secret." Langston's face turned from red to white. He leaned over and whispered something to Elaine, who immediately shook her head in alarm. A younger homeowner, Sarah Jensen, raised her hand. "I'd like to make a motion," she said clearly. "Before any action is taken regarding the trucks, I move that we investigate the creek modification project and determine whether proper procedures were followed." "Seconded," called out multiple voices from around the room. Langston looked cornered. Under HOA rules, he had to allow the vote. "All in favor?" Sarah asked. Nearly every hand in the room went up. "Why don't we adjourn for today?" Grant suggested. "Give everyone time to review these documents, and perhaps our president should contact the county environmental office himself before they contact him." Langston glared at me with such hatred that a chill ran up my spine. "This meeting is adjourned," he muttered, hastily gathering his papers. As residents began filing out, many stopped to take a closer look at the documents I'd brought. Grant approached with a small group of homeowners I hadn't met before. "I'm impressed," he said, extending a hand. "Your research was thorough. I've been building a case against Langston for a while now, but I needed something big to push it forward." "Why?" I asked, shaking his hand. Grant lowered his voice. "Because there's more going on here than just a buried stream. A lot more." He looked around and leaned closer. "Have you reviewed the HOA's financial records lately? Or noticed which homes got new roofs last year's hailstorm and which didn't? Langston isn't just bending rules, he's breaking laws." I stared at him, realizing this neighborhood battle had just exploded beyond my personal fight. "We should talk," said one of the women in his group. "I'm on the county water board. If that creek is what Grant says it is, we might be looking at serious environmental violations." We exchanged contact info. As I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I saw Langston across the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes locked on us. The look on his face made my skin crawl. What had I stumbled into? This had started as a fight over a quiet, beloved creek. Now, it felt like the start of something much bigger and far more dangerous.
How deep did this corruption go, and what was Langston willing to do to keep it hidden? At exactly 9 a.m., County Environmental Inspector Maria Ramirez pulled her government-issued SUV into my driveway. 2 more official vehicles followed behind. Curious neighbors peeked through their blinds as uniformed inspectors fanned out across my backyard with measuring equipment and sample collection kits. "The creek bed appears to have been filled with non-permeable material," Maria observed, scraping at the decorative rocks. "This violates Section 44 of the Clean Water Act. Did anyone file environmental impact statements before this work began?" "Not that I'm aware of," I replied. "The HOA president ordered it done." "Fines start at $225,000 per day of violation," she said, snapping photos, "plus mandatory restoration costs." Grant joined us, unrolling his neighborhood maps. "This stream is part of a protected watershed," he explained to Maria. "It feeds directly into Harmon Reservoir. That makes it a public water supply concern, too." Maria frowned, typing into her tablet. "We'll need to begin testing for potential contaminants immediately." A silver Mercedes screeched to a stop at the curb. Langston emerged, adjusting his tie as he stormed across my lawn. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "You have no authority to bring government officials onto HOA property without board approval." Maria turned to face him, slowly and deliberately. "Mr. Langston, I'm Maria Ramirez with the County Environmental Protection Division. This isn't HOA property, according to our records, and we have full authority to investigate Clean Water Act violations without your permission." Langston's posture shifted. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice smoothing out. "Our landscaping project was fully approved." "Approved by whom?" Maria cut in. "We have no permits, no environmental impact report, no water diversion application, nothing." Langston shot me a look of pure venom. "You need to speak with me, privately." "Anything you have to say can be said here." He stepped in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Move those trucks today or face consequences. This neighborhood has rules." "So does the Clean Water Act," I countered. He turned on his heel and stormed off, his phone already pressed to his ear. Watching him retreat, I felt a cold pit settle in my stomach. "He seems charming," Maria said dryly. "We'll need statements from both of you. This investigation could take weeks."
After the inspectors left, Grant and I sat on my back patio going over our notes with mugs of coffee between us. I looked out across what had once been a serene stream, gentle, bubbling water where deer came to drink at dawn and fireflies lit up humid summer evenings. Now it was just a stretch of dry rocks and scarred dirt. Langston moved fast after he became president, amended bylaws to give the board more power, raised dues, launched all these beautification projects nobody asked for. But why target my creek? I asked. Grant shrugged. Maybe because you're newer, fewer long-standing relationships, easier to isolate and push around.
My phone buzzed with a message from my cousin, Marcus. Someone slashed all the truck tires. Filing police report now. I showed the message to Grant. Langston, he said immediately. He's getting desperate. We drove to the access road, where Marcus stood with 2 police officers next to the vandalized trucks. All 20 tires had been shredded into ribbons. "This is clear vandalism and destruction of property," one officer said while taking notes. "Any idea who might be responsible?" Before I could respond, Grant pointed up at a streetlight. "There's a security camera. Neighborhood Watch installed them last year." The second officer stepped closer. "It's working. We'll pull the footage." "No need," came a voice from behind us. It was Mrs. Holcomb, the 78-year-old who lived in the corner house. She approached slowly, holding out her iPad. "I saw someone acting suspicious this morning and checked my doorbell cam. Already downloaded the video." She handed the tablet over. The footage was clear. Langston, walking slowly around the trucks at 3 a.m., knife in hand, slashing each tire one by one. "Well," said the first officer, "that makes our job easier." The police left immediately to track Langston down. Meanwhile, more neighbors were gathering around the trucks, drawn by the noise and tension. "He really slashed all these tires?" asked Sarah Jensen, shaking her head. "That's not just petty, it's insane." "And expensive," added Marcus. "We're talking about $112,000 in damages." Grant checked his watch. They should be at his house by now. Right on cue, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered cautiously. "This is Officer Patel with the Lakewood Police Department. Are you the homeowner who filed the vandalism report on Arbor Drive?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Sir, you may want to come to the station. There's been a development." Grant drove us there. Officer Patel met us in the lobby. "We went to arrest Mr. Langston for vandalism, but when we got there, he was in the middle of shredding documents. Lots of documents." "HOA records?" Grant guessed. "Financial records," Officer Patel confirmed. When we questioned him, his answers didn't add up. We got a warrant to search the rest of the home and found something interesting. He led us into a small conference room. The table was covered in financial ledgers and unmarked folders. "These appear to be HOA financial records, but they don't match the official filings with the county. We're looking at 2 separate sets of books." Grant picked up one of the ledgers and flipped through the pages. His eyebrows rose. "These show over $300,000 in maintenance contracts paid to a company called J&L Maintenance Group. That name is nowhere in the official HOA records." Officer Patel nodded. "J&L Maintenance Group is registered to Lawrence Langston, Langston's brother." My head spun. "He's been embezzling HOA funds?" "It appears so," Officer Patel replied. "And that's not all. We found environmental study documents for your creek. They clearly state it's a protected waterway. It cannot be altered or modified without specific permits." "So he knew it," I said quietly. "He had the information before ordering the work done." "Why would he deliberately break environmental law?" I asked aloud. Grant was still reviewing the files. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a marked-up map. It showed my creek flowing toward a 10-acre parcel just outside the neighborhood boundaries. The property was labeled Future Development. Officer Patel leaned in. Langston's wife works for Stonebrook Development Corporation. They've been trying to build luxury townhomes there for years, but they've had water access issues. The puzzle snapped into place. So by diverting the creek, he was solving a water access issue for his wife's company and probably getting kickbacks in return. And those shady maintenance contracts, added Grant, could be how they're laundering the money. A female officer entered the room. "Sir, Langston is requesting a lawyer. His wife just arrived and is demanding to speak with someone." Catherine Langston, always flawless, always perfectly poised, stood in the doorway looking like a ghost. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her silk blouse half untucked. "What has James done?" she whispered, staring at the records strewn across the table.
"Mrs. Langston, we have a few questions about Stonebrook Development and their interest in the Lakewood watershed." Catherine Langston's face crumpled. "I told him it wasn't worth it," she whispered. "I told him someone would notice eventually." The quiet suburb I had moved to for peace had now become the epicenter of what was clearly a criminal conspiracy, one involving environmental violations, embezzlement, and who knew what else. As Catherine began to outline a scheme more elaborate than any of us had imagined, I caught Grant's eye across the table. His subtle nod confirmed what I was thinking. This had gone far beyond my trucks or my little creek. How many lives had Langston damaged with his schemes? And who else in our seemingly wholesome neighborhood was caught in this tangled web of corruption?
The emergency HOA meeting felt different this time. Instead of the usual 20 attendees, nearly 100 neighbors packed into the Lakewood Community Center. Some leaned against the walls, others sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor. My heart pounded as Margaret Tanner tapped the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Margaret began, her voice smooth and honey-sweet as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "With James Langston temporarily stepping aside due to personal matters, I'll be serving as your acting HOA president." A wave of whispers passed through the crowd. Langston's arrest for vandalism and the exposure of financial irregularities had shaken our quiet enclave. I caught several people glancing my way. Some looked sympathetic. Others barely hid their suspicion or resentment. "Our first priority," Margaret continued, her tone solemn, "must be healing this community." She paused, scanning the room. "Lakewood Glen has always been a premium neighborhood with high property values. We must maintain those standards." I felt tension rising in my chest. I knew where this was going. "Starting with the removal of those unsightly trucks that are still blocking the emergency access road, and addressing unauthorized landscaping modifications." Her gaze locked squarely on me. "The board will enforce all covenant violations equally." The room erupted in applause. My stomach sunk. Langston might have been gone, but his policies and their enforcers were alive and well. "The creek destruction was illegal," I shouted, rising to my feet. "They diverted a protected waterway without permits." Margaret's smile didn't even flicker. "We're currently reviewing the proper procedures," she said coolly. "In the meantime, those trucks must be moved within 48 hours or they will be towed at the owner's expense." More nods, more murmurs of agreement.
I felt isolated until a hand touched my shoulder. "May I?" Grant Mitchell asked quietly, motioning toward the microphone. I nodded, grateful beyond words. Grant stepped forward and cleared his throat. "I've lived in Lakewood for 7 years, and until last week I'd never spoken at one of these meetings. I regret that now." He opened a leather portfolio and held up a document. "According to our HOA bylaws, any environmental modification requiring government permits also requires a 2/3 homeowner approval, not just board approval." Margaret's smile grew tight. "That's not how the board interprets. It's exactly what Section 12, Paragraph 8 states," I cut in firmly. "I've already contacted 3 other homeowners whose water features were quietly filled in last year. We're forming a creek restoration committee." 3 people stood up around the room: Sophia Patel, David Wilson, and Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman from the cul-de-sac. "And," Grant added, "we now have enough votes to trigger a recall election for the entire board." The room went completely still. Margaret's face flushed a deep, angry red. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "We're trying to maintain the standards that keep your home values high." "You destroyed my property without legal authority," I said, finally finding my voice. "The Environmental Office is already investigating." "Let's put it to a community vote," someone else called out, "and see what the people really want." Mrs. Abernathy raised her trembling hand. "My husband and I moved here because of the trees, the creeks, the quiet. Now it looks like every other generic development. We lost something special." Margaret slammed the gavel. "Fine," she barked. "According to our bylaws, we'll schedule a recall vote in 30 days. Until then, this board remains in charge." And she pointed directly at me. "And those trucks still need to be moved."
For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Several neighbors came up to shake my hand afterward. Grant introduced me to the other members of our coalition. "I'm an environmental engineer," Sophia explained. "What they did to your creek violates at least 3 watershed protection laws." "And I'm a retired attorney," David added with a grin. "They picked the wrong neighborhood." We agreed to meet the next evening at my house to develop our strategy. That night, I finally went to bed feeling like I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made me stop in my tracks.
The notice was taped to my door. My hands trembled as I read it. Violation. Unauthorized vehicles. Fines accrue at $200 per day. Eviction proceedings to begin after 30 days of non-compliance. I called Grant immediately. He'd received the exact same notice. So had Sophia and Mrs. Abernathy. Only David had been spared. A pattern was emerging. Anyone who stood against the board was being targeted. Later that afternoon, as I returned from grocery shopping, I spotted Margaret and 2 other board members standing across the street, snapping photos of my house. When they saw me, they didn't even pretend to hide what they were doing. "Just documenting ongoing violations," Margaret called out sweetly. "And oh, you might want to trim those bushes. They're 2 inches above regulation height." That night, identical unsigned notes appeared on all our doors. "Drop the recall or face eviction proceedings. This is your only warning." They bore the HOA letterhead, but no signature. When Grant called the HOA's legal firm the next morning to verify, they flatly denied sending any such notices.
Someone was trying to scare us. But who?
We gathered at my house that evening as planned. Mrs. Abernathy brought a tin of homemade cookies, and Sophia spread property maps across my dining table. "Look at this," Sophia said, pointing to the thin blue lines that snaked across the map. "These are natural waterways, part of the original watershed that existed before the development was built. Your creek isn't just a backyard feature," she continued. "It's a headwater tributary that feeds into Riverside Lake." David adjusted his glasses, examining the maps. "That means it's protected under state watershed laws. The original developers would have needed special permits just to build near it. So why is the current board so desperate to cover them up?" Grant asked. "Money," Mrs. Abernathy said simply. "Something's not right with the finances. My Herbert was HOA treasurer for 15 years before he passed. He used to say development companies were always trying to buy influence with the board." A knock at the door startled all of us. I opened it to find Catherine Langston, James's wife, standing nervously on the porch. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. "There's something you all need to know." We stared in silence as Catherine placed a USB drive on my table. "James isn't the mastermind," she said softly. "He's a pawn in something bigger, and I'm afraid you've kicked a hornet's nest." Her hands shook as she accepted the tea I offered. We watched her cautiously as she plugged the drive into my laptop. Dozens of files appeared: emails, contracts, photographs. 3 years ago, Catherine began, Thomas Quinn of Quinn Development approached the HOA board. His company wanted to build luxury townhomes on the vacant land behind Pine Haven Meadows. She opened a chain of emails. But there was one major obstacle. That land is a designated floodplain. Sophia leaned forward. "Which makes it almost impossible to get permits." "Exactly," Catherine nodded. "Unless the water could be diverted elsewhere." It clicked immediately. "So they had to eliminate the creeks in the neighborhood," I said, horrified, "to change the water flow and make the floodplain appear safe for building." Catherine continued. "Quinn offered James and the other board members premium home upgrades in exchange for their cooperation. Renovated kitchens, in-ground pools, new roofs, all for free. In return, they started targeting properties with natural drainage paths, labeling them safety hazards or aesthetic violations." Trevor let out a low whistle. "That's textbook bribery." "Did you notice who got targeted first? Homes along the natural drainage paths?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened. "Mine was the first to go. They said my little stream was attracting mosquitoes, but I'd had that creek for 15 years and never had a problem." "Because this was never about property values," David said grimly. "It was about manipulating hydrology to greenlight development and covering their tracks." I pulled out township maps I'd found earlier that week at the county records office. "Look here, my creek isn't just any water feature. It's part of a protected watershed that supplies drinking water to 3 counties. Catherine nodded. "Quinn knows that. That's why they're racing to finish the beautification projects before state environmental inspectors can intervene. Once the creeks are gone, it's harder to prove what was there." Grant frowned. "So what happens if they succeed?" Sophia's expression darkened. "They build on a floodplain, make millions selling those townhomes. Then, when the flooding inevitably happens, it's the new homeowners who pay the price. And the rest of us are left with drainage problems, higher insurance costs, and destroyed ecosystems." Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out one more document.
"This," she said, unfolding it carefully, "is the recall petition."
"The election is just the beginning," Catherine said quietly. "If you win, Quinn will lose millions. I found this draft lawsuit on James's computer. They're prepared to sue each of you personally if you continue." The room fell silent. David finally broke the tension with a short laugh. "Ha ha, let them try. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. I welcome that fight." "We need to take this public," Trevor suggested. "The local news would love this story." "And I can get the Environmental Protection Office involved," Sophia added. "With this evidence, they'll have to act." Mrs. Abernathy reached across the table to squeeze Catherine's hand. "Thank you for your bravery, dear. It couldn't have been easy to turn against your husband." Catherine wiped away a tear. "James wasn't always like this. Money and power changed him. I've already filed for divorce."
The next morning, I called Diane Fleming, a local reporter known for covering environmental stories. She arrived within hours, camera crew in tow. "HOA allegedly accepting bribes to damage protected watersheds," she murmured, reviewing our files. "That's quite a headline." The story aired that evening. By morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors I'd never even met called to offer support. Environmental groups pledged legal aid. The county commissioner's office announced an immediate investigation. Then, Margaret Tanner showed up at my door, unannounced. Her usual composure was gone. "What have you done?" she hissed. "Quinn Development is threatening to sue all of us. They say we guaranteed them those permits." "You made illegal promises you couldn't keep," I replied calmly. "And you damaged my property in the process." Her voice cracked with something I hadn't heard before. Genuine fear. "You don't understand what you're messing with. These people aren't just developers. They have connections." Before I could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway. Thomas Quinn stepped out. Tall, expensive suit, perfect smile, but his eyes never matched it. "So this is the troublemaker," he said, scanning me up and down. "Let's talk privately about how we can resolve this situation to everyone's benefit." "There's nothing to discuss," I answered, aware that several neighbors were stepping out of their homes, watching. "You tried to destroy a protected watershed for profit." Quinn's smile never faded. "I'm prepared to offer you a very generous compensation package. New kitchen, bathroom remodel, even a pool, whatever you want. I want my creek restored, and I want you held accountable for what you did." His expression darkened. "Don't be stupid. Everyone has a price." "Not everyone," Trevor called from the sidewalk, walking up the driveway with Sophia, David, and at least 20 other neighbors behind him. "And certainly not this community." Quinn looked around at the gathering crowd, his confidence visibly shaken. "The recall election is tomorrow," I said, "and we've submitted everything to the county prosecutor. Your problems are just beginning."
That night, an emergency town hall meeting was called. Nearly every homeowner attended. Catherine stood before the crowd and told them everything about the bribes, the environmental destruction, the backroom deals. "I was complicit through my silence," she admitted. "But I can't stand by while this company threatens our homes and our watershed." Thomas Quinn arrived with 3 lawyers, hoping to intimidate us. But something remarkable happened. One by one, neighbors stood up to speak. They shared how their water features had been removed, how they'd been bullied by the board, how they missed the natural beauty Pine Haven once had.
Quinn tried to speak, but was drowned out by boos. His attorneys whispered urgently in his ear. He scanned the hostile room, and without another word, they slipped out the side door. As the meeting ended, Margaret approached me, several board members trailing behind. "We want to resign before the recall," she said quietly, "and we're willing to testify about Quinn's offers if needed." I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't expected: remorse. "Help us fix what we broke," I told her. "That's all I ever wanted."
The election would decide our future, but that night something already felt different. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other were deep in conversation about restoration plans. Children played near the now empty creek beds. Someone started a petition to rename the park after Mrs. Abernathy's late husband. For the first time in weeks, I felt something precious: hope. Election day arrived with a buzz Pine Haven hadn't felt in years. People lined up outside the community center before the doors opened. Neighbors who used to avoid each other now talked about watershed protection, zoning codes, and community rights. "Never thought I'd see you here, Carol," I said to an elderly woman who rarely left her house. She nodded toward the street. "When those trucks showed up, I knew something was wrong." "I started paying attention," Carol said with a wink. "Nobody messes with our water." Inside the crowded room, tension hung heavy. James Reynolds sat in the back corner, arms crossed, whispering to the few allies he had left. Trevor stood at the podium, speaking confidently about his vision for a more transparent HOA. When he invited me up to share the creek restoration plan, Reynolds suddenly stood. "This man illegally blocked our road. He should be arrested, not elected," he shouted, pointing directly at me. The room went silent. I took a steady breath. The creek that was destroyed without proper permits has been in my family for generations. My grandchildren were supposed to play there, just like my children did. I looked around the room. What would you do if someone took something precious from you? Across the room, Catherine Reynolds nodded slightly, sitting far from her husband. Voting began. People lined up at the makeshift booths we'd set up. I caught Reynolds glaring at me, his eyes narrow with hatred. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been worth it: the stress, the threats, the division in our once peaceful neighborhood. 2 hours later, the results were announced. Trevor had been elected HOA president, with me serving as environmental committee chair. Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The victory felt bittersweet. Won through pain, but still a win. "First order of business," Trevor said firmly, "filing formal charges against Quinn Development for environmental violations and restoring the creek." The room erupted in applause. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my security system triggered, movement in the yard. I looked through the window and saw a dark figure near my garage. I called the police and then cautiously stepped outside. It was Reynolds. Spray paint can in hand, he was scrawling "Traitor" across my garage door. When police arrived, they discovered more than vandalism tools in his car. There were printouts of neighbors who had opposed him with detailed notes about their supposed HOA violations. He had been building a file to retaliate. News of Reynolds' arrest spread fast. The local paper ran the headline, "Former HOA President Arrested, Corruption and Vandalism in Pine Haven Meadows." Quinn Development issued a formal denial of wrongdoing, but soon anonymous sources inside the company began leaking internal emails that told a different story. By the end of the week, their trucks had moved out for good. But not before delivering the materials for our restoration project. My cousin Derek showed up with his construction crew. "This story's too good not to be part of," he said, grabbing a shovel.
Neighbors I'd never spoken to came by with gloves and tools. Even Elaine Walker, a former ally of Reynolds, arrived with sandwiches for the volunteers. I bought into his vision of perfect property values, she admitted, as we watched kids place river rocks along the creek bed. During a water break, Catherine came to sit beside me. Her eyes were tired but steady. "I filed for divorce," she said simply. "This whole mess made me realize how controlling James has been, not just with the HOA, but with me." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. "I'd like to help with the restoration," she added. "Before James, I was an environmental science teacher. He thought it wasn't prestigious enough." Over the next few months, the transformation was remarkable, not just of the land, but of the people. Former enemies worked side by side. The creek began to flow again, clearer and stronger than before. Wildlife returned, first insects, then frogs, then birds that hadn't been seen in years. Reynolds pled guilty to vandalism and harassment. As part of his plea deal, he sold his house and moved away from Pine Haven Meadows. No one was sorry to see the moving truck. Quinn Development was hit with hefty fines for environmental violations. Their luxury townhome project was denied final approval. The land they bought was eventually donated to a conservation trust, a far cry from the high-end condos they had envisioned. 6 months after the election, we held a grand opening for what was now called Community Creek Park. Children ran along the banks of the restored waterway, while parents chatted on new benches. A small outdoor exhibit explained the watershed's importance and how it connected to the larger river system. Catherine, now using her maiden name, Wilson, cut the ribbon. She had become a neighborhood's unofficial environmental educator, organizing creek exploration days for local kids. "It's hard to believe James wanted to bury all of this under rocks and mulch," she said, gesturing toward the thriving green space. Trevor arrived with a group of county officials, smiling. "Your trucks caused quite a stir," one commissioner told me, "but sometimes people need a wake-up call." As the celebration continued, I wandered to a quiet bend in the creek. The water burbled gently over stones, calm and constant. I hadn't heard that sound in so long. A small group of children were catching and releasing tadpoles under Catherine's watchful eye. "My grandpa says you saved the creek," a little boy said, looking up at me with wide eyes. I smiled. "We all saved it. Sometimes you just have to stand up for what matters." That evening, as the celebration wound down, I found myself sitting on a bench overlooking the water with Trevor and Catherine. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Trevor asked. I didn't answer right away. I just looked out over the shimmering creek, listening to the wind in the trees, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace.
"Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Trevor asked. I shook my head. "I was just angry about my creek. I never meant to start a movement." "That's how change happens," Catherine said quietly. "One person gets pushed too far and stands their ground." As neighbors called their goodbyes and strolled home along paths that now connected our properties instead of dividing them, I realized something profound had shifted. My small act of rebellion, the blocked trucks, the defiant stand, had cracked open something that had been building for years. Yes, there had been resentment, but beneath that, a deeper desire for real connection, for community. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong and water flowing. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. The HOA still existed, but under Trevor's leadership, it had become something different, something better. A group focused not on enforcing arbitrary rules, but on bringing people together. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and watched the creek sparkle in the morning light. My phone buzzed, a message from Catherine. "Creek Cleanup Committee meeting today. Bring ideas and friends." I smiled.
What had started with a buried creek and some block trucks had given us something none of us expected. A neighborhood that finally felt like home.